I'm not sure if this is down leveling it or up leveling it a bit, but we're going to talk a bit tonight about WordPress infrastructure, and specifically WordPress infrastructure on Amazon Lightsail. As was mentioned, my name is Jerry Hargrove. I'm the Lightsail developer advocate at AWS. You can find me on Twitter at AWS Geek and awsgeek.com. But tonight, I'm going to talk specifically about three things, really. Number one, I'm going to give just for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm going to give you just a real brief overview of Amazon Lightsail, what it is, what you can do with it. It won't be too markety, mostly just high-level features. And then I'll talk just in general terms about high availability. When I mean building a highly available WordPress site out on Amazon Lightsail, what do those terms mean and what are those different definitions? But the bulk of this talk will be on that third item there, which is highly available WordPress on Lightsail. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about that. So hopefully by the end of this quick talk, you'll understand what I'm talking about and what features and capabilities are available on Lightsail if you're running a WordPress site on AWS. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Amazon Lightsail, what is Amazon Lightsail? So Lightsail is really a virtual private server, or VPS, and some of you may be familiar with that. It's like a super easy way to get started on AWS for developers, small businesses, students. Others are looking for a solution to build something out in the cloud without going over to AWS and launching instances and load balancers, et cetera. Lightsail by itself provides you with all the compute and storage and networking capacity that you need to launch an instance, and it comes with low predictable pricing. I'll talk a bit about blueprints and OSs. You can also run databases, and you get in-console networking and more features there. Lightsail is really ideal for simpler workloads, quick deployments. As you get started on AWS, it's designed to help you start out small and then scale as you grow. It makes projects super easy by automating a lot of the underlying networking access and security environments, and takes the guesswork out of launching servers, VPS servers. And it allows you to scale very easily. And that's sort of a related to becoming more highly available is also looking at how to scale a WordPress instance. So if you're not using a managed WordPress provider that takes care of all of that for you, how to do that on Lightsail, where you're managing that infrastructure for yourself. Every Lightsail instance comes with high performing SSD storage, and really manages all those cloud resources for you. One of the more interesting aspects of Lightsail from our customers' perspective is its super predictable pricing. So when you go in, you can launch a WordPress instance, for example, and if you choose the smallest plan or bundle, it costs you $3.50 a month, and you get 512 megabytes of memory and a single vCPU. When you launch a Lightsail instance, you also you get static IP addresses and DNS management with it, and you're charged on an hourly on-demand basis. So like the rest of other AWS services, you only pay for these resources when you're using them. Lightsail offers a number of one-click blueprints. And WordPress, of course, is one of our most popular blueprints and what we're going to talk about tonight. But as you can see on the screen here, there are many other blueprints that you can choose from, depending on what your application. You may be running a Magento e-commerce site, or you need an Nginx server, or you're running Plesk or what have you. You can launch all of those with just a single click. If you want to, you can also simply launch an operating system like Ubuntu or Debian. If you wanted to launch the latest version or use the latest version of WordPress, for example, you might launch an OS-only blueprint and then install it yourself. You can choose from Linux or Windows, and choose from any of these prepackaged applications that we have available to you. So it's more than just a virtual private server. That's the core of Lightsail. Lightsail also includes databases, content delivery networks or CDNs, load balancers, DNS management, and we recently launched container support. So you can do a lot of things on Lightsail with very little upfront investment in terms of infrastructure and cloud experience. One of the other nice features about Lightsail is, yes, it is part of AWS. You can access other AWS services from Lightsail. You might just launch your WordPress instance in Lightsail because it's very easy to get up and running, but you need access to other services on AWS like DynamoDB or Elasticache, for example. You can access all of those through VPC peering and connect to those other resources in the default VPC. You can also very easily upgrade from a Lightsail instance to EC2. We provide a managed guided experience that allows you to take your instances running on Lightsail and through the use of a snapshot, and then very easily follow some step-by-step instructions to migrate over to EC2. So when you're ready to grow and you're ready to expand outside of Lightsail, we make it really easy to do that. Popular workloads that run on Lightsail, websites, simple web apps. As I mentioned, WordPress is one of our more popular blueprints. We have a lot of customers who are running WordPress on Lightsail. You can also run business software. You can run Windows applications, bare bones operating systems, and run your favorite back office or line of business software. And one of my favorite use cases for Lightsail, and one that I use pretty frequently, is as a dev test environment. I can spin up an Ubuntu instance in just a matter of minutes, configure it with my dev tools, and be off and running very quickly. So that's a quick intro into Lightsail. Quick and to the point. So now let's get on to sort of the meat of this webinar, which is high availability. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk just for a few minutes again, just to establish some definitions so we're all on the same page. When I talk about high availability, or HA, you'll hear me say that too. I'm talking about really maximizing uptime, and specifically in this case of WordPress. So the amount of time users or customers can access WordPress, or conversely, I'm trying to minimize downtime. But this is still kind of subjective, right? Your idea of highly available might be different than mine, and it might be different than that of your neighbors. So let's look at some of the language that we can use to measure what we really mean by high availability. So many of you may have seen or heard of this before, the number of nines of availability. We express system uptime in terms of a percentage of the total system time, right? So for example, 2 nines of availability, if you look down on the bottom left of your screen, is 99% uptime, which really means that if you look at over the course of a year, that could include up to 87.5 hours of downtime during that year, that's quite a bit. But it depends on the site and what you're doing with it. 3 nines is 8.75 hours, sort of in the middle of that chart. 4 nines is just short of an hour of downtime a year, and 5 nines is just over 5 minutes of downtime a year. And so you have to look at that and think, ultimately what your end users and customers care about is whether your site is available when they need it and when they need to use it. And at the same time, though, the nines are really a nice shorthand way of talking about that. One thing to keep in mind is as you look at that table from bottom to top, as the number of nines increase from 2 nines to 3 nines, 4 nines, 5 nines, that typically means more money. More nines means more money. So the question you have to ask yourself when we're talking about high availability tonight is where you fall in that spectrum of nines. What do you need for your particular website, or what do your clients need for their websites or their WordPress sites? Is it a small family personal blog that someone is running? Do they really need 5 nines of availability, Probably not. You know, my grandmother is going to visit my personal blog once a week. So it really doesn't need to have 5 nines of availability, maybe just a couple nines for me. But then again, if you're working with a client who's running a small business storefront or some business critical systems, then you need to start working your way up the list of nines and maybe go up to 3 nines or 4 nines. If that site is down during typical business hours, then that customer or client may be losing money. If we look at health and safety or other sort of global enterprise systems, then we start looking at, you know, the need to go to 4 nines or 5 nines of availability, where the cost can be significantly more. So really, in the end, where you fall in that spectrum is totally up to you or to your client or where they're at. Regardless of where you land, though, you can think of it as sort of an evolutionary process. Achieving high availability for your WordPress application is more than likely going to be some form of a journey or evolution instead of just a single one-time event. You're not going to go from, you know, 1 9 or 2 nines of availability to 5 nines overnight. Usually those requirements increase over time, and they may be different a year from now than they are today. So with that, before we get started, there's another definition that I wanted to throw out there, or a couple of other terms. The first one is a single point of failure in terms of high availability. What does that mean? Quite simply, a single point of failure is a part of a system that if that part of the system fails, it would cause the entire system to stop working. For example, you know, in WordPress, if you have a single database running and you have multiple WordPress instances accessing that database, if that single database fails, then your system is likely going to be unusable. And we call that a single point of failure. But it can also apply to other parts of your system, whether it's frameworks, the virtualization layer, hardware that you're running it on, or the infrastructure that surrounds that hardware. So their single points of failure are undesirable, and you'll see as I'm talking about high availability that a lot of high availability is really centered around removing some of those single points of failure in the system. A couple of other terms that I'm going to be talking about in probably the next 30 minutes or so are a recovery point objective and recovery time objective, or RPO and RTO respectively. Some of you may be familiar with those terms. RTO is the one I'll focus the most on tonight, and it really indicates, you know, in terms of high availability, if your system were to fail, how long would it take you to get it back up and running? So how much time would your system be down in the case of some sort of catastrophic failure if it weren't highly available? RPO, on the other hand, indicates how much data might be lost as a result of that failure. Again, I'll be focusing mostly on RTO tonight, but I'll bring up RPO occasionally and I'll call it out. So as a matter of fact, I'll use a more concise version. You'll see this diagram again later on to keep track of how we're progressing against this RPO and RTO. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So now we're to the actual meat of the presentation. I'm going to start talking about how to make your WordPress instance highly available on Lightsail. So when you launch a Lightsail instance, a VPS with the WordPress blueprint, among other things, you get a fully functioning, running WordPress instance, you know, inside of a couple of minutes. It can be very quickly from the time you click OK to the time you can actually log in as administrator to your WordPress site. As part of that instantiation, you get a public IP address. And with that public IP address, you can reach your Lightsail instance and then use it as the destination for DNS, for example. So you might take that public IP address, point your www.example.com to that public IP address, and then obviously each time an end user goes to visit your website, they query DNS, they get that IP address back, and then they are directed to that Lightsail instance with that IP address. So that works great. That works fine, and you may do that and have no problems at all for a very long amount of time. But what happens if something happens to that instance, that Lightsail instance? So when you start a new Lightsail instance, say for example, you had to stop and restart this Lightsail instance. When that happens, a Lightsail instance gets a new public IP address. And you may, this could have been because of an actual outage, or it might have been, because of something as innocuous as having to stop and restart your instance. But what happens is the IP address of that instance changes. So let's look at what happens when, if that IP address of your Lightsail instance changes. So assuming you started with a bare bones IP or a Lightsail instance and simply pointed DNS at that IP address, here's really what you would have to do. Now, obviously it's going to be a little bit different for you, your individual use case, but it looks a lot like when you launched it the first time. You're going to pick out a new Lightsail instance and pick a region where you want it to run. So that's someplace in one of AWS's regions around the world. You're going to pick a capacity, a blueprint, for example, WordPress. And then you're going to configure that WordPress instance. In the case of some sort of failure, you're going to install a theme, your favorite plugins, and then you're going to upload and recreate the content that you had on it. Again, this is assuming there were no backups or any other way of recreating this. How long it takes to do that depends on how much content you have and whether it's manual or automatic or whether you're using plugins or not. And finally, you need to update DNS. And the question is why? Why do I need to update DNS? Well, if your instance fails, if your Lightsail instance fails, and it started back up, each time you start with a new public IP address, and you need to tell DNS, you need to update your DNS provider and tell it to use the new IP address. And so the question is, how long does it take for DNS to propagate? Well, if I go back all the way to the left-hand side of the screen and look at how much time it would take to recover an instance, it might take a few minutes to launch a Lightsail instance, might take a few hours to restore your WordPress content, again, depending on what kind of content you had and whether you're using manual processes or automation. Updating DNS could take significantly longer. I put a day here, but it can be shorter than that. It can be hours, or it can be even on the order of tens of minutes. But what happens with DNS is if you update the IP address in DNS, it could take a significant amount of time for that value to propagate out to the end users of your client, for example. During that period, some users might still be pointing at the old IP and get nothing, and some others might get your new IP. And so that's bad news. So if we look back at our chart of recovery objectives and our goal of achieving HA or high availability, we can see that our RTO or recovery time objective may be on the order of days in this case, based on what we just defined. So this seems like a good place to get started on our sort of journey to high availability. How can we fix that DNS propagation issue? And if you could see me, well, you can, I'm making air quotes around fixing, right? Why? Well, because we're not going to really fix that. DNS and DNS propagation are simply matters of fact. That's how DNS works. It could take some time. We're going to fix it by avoiding it altogether. And so we're going to do that by replacing that single public IP address with a static IP address. And this is pretty simple and straightforward. Lightsail provides you with the ability to replace your default public IP address of your instance with a static IP address. And static IP addresses are yours to keep and yours to use. Once you've allocated it, you can continue using that for as long as you'd like. And static IP addresses are free. There's no additional cost to these. You can take a static IP address and assign it to an instance, Lightsail instance that's running, and then you can take that static IP address and update your DNS with that IP address. And then if your Lightsail instance is ever stopped and restarted, for example, yes, it will get a new public IP address, but now you have this separate static IP address that's pointing at it. And so from a DNS perspective, that never changed. So really effectively, we've solved the DNS issue with a static IP address. That's pretty straightforward to do. So if we go back to our scorecard here and look at it, and we use a static IP address to reduce the RTO from days where it is now to potentially hours, right? Just by using a single static IP address. So you don't no longer have to worry about DNS. And as I mentioned before, a static IP address on Lightsail is free. So you can do all of this fairly inexpensively, with no additional cost. Okay, so now that we've solved that and we've addressed that, how do we deal with restoring WordPress content that's on this Lightsail instance? Yes, you can do all of the things I mentioned before. You can do the manual process of completely rebuilding it, or you may have some plugins, you may have some backups or some plugins that do backups for you. But in my case, when I set the stage for this, I really set up this WordPress site without a lot of forethought. I'm simply a WordPress user. I wasn't thinking about what I would do, when or if something happened. I just wanted to get it up as quick as possible. So I was really thinking about how to build it the first time and not what I would need to do to build it the second time. So I may not have plugins installed. I may not be using backup plugins, but I can certainly use other features available on Lightsail to speed this process up. I can use Lightsail Snapshots. So Lightsail instances come with the ability to do automatic daily backups of those Lightsail systems. So this is it's not just a WordPress backup, it's a complete system snapshot of the entire disk, and it happens automatically. You can specify when you want it done during the day. So you can specify, a time of the day when maybe traffic is low. Doing a backup doesn't impact the availability of the site, but you can do it when you think that there's not going to be a lot of traffic on the site. These snapshots are incremental backups. And so each one, the first time you do an automatic snapshot on Lightsail, it's going to be a full and complete backup of that system. And each time after that, it's just going to be an incremental backup. So a delta of what's changed between the last backup and this one. So if you have a fairly static site that doesn't change a lot and no one makes any changes to the site during that day, then that incremental backup is going to be fairly minimal. And you get 7 automatic snapshots stored with your Lightsail instance. So you could, in theory, roll your Lightsail instance back to whatever state it was 7 days ago or 6 days ago. And there's a monthly storage fee for those Lightsail snapshots, pretty minimal. It doesn't cost a whole lot to do that. So going back to our scorecard again, we look at previously reduced the RTO of our system from days to hours by adding a static IP address. We can further remove or we can further reduce that RTO from hours to minutes using Lightsail snapshots. And the number of minutes that it actually takes is how long it takes to restore that snapshot and reassign a static IP address. So really what's happening is if there's a failure of your system, you have to restart it, then the amount of time that it takes to do all of that is determined by how much time it takes you to restart a Lightsail instance using a particular snapshot and then reassign that static IP address to your Lightsail instance. The second thing that using Lightsail Snapshots does is it helps us with our RPO. And as I mentioned before, RPO is our recovery point objective, and that really defines how much data we might lose as a result of a system outage. And in this case, daily snapshots mean at worst case, we might lose 24 hours worth of data. So for example, if you set up your automated snapshots to happen at midnight every night, and then a user came in at 6 a.m. in the morning and published a new blog post, and then at 10 a.m. that morning, there was an outage and you had to restore to a snapshot, you would restore it to potentially the most recent snapshot, which was at midnight the night before, which would mean you might lose that particular user's blog post that they created. So, but it helps us define exactly what that is. Now we have 24 hours of RPO that we have to deal with, and we'll work on improving that a little bit later on. So this right here may be enough for many. This might be fine. You might stop right here and call it good. As a matter of fact, if you do nothing more than that's fine. You should at least implement this couple of steps. If you're running your WordPress site on Lightsail and you haven't done these two things, this is the takeaway that you should get from it. Assign a static IP address to your Lightsail instance and then enable automated snapshots. You can get a lot of mileage out of this. It's really easy and it's an inexpensive way to gain a significant amount of availability over what you currently have. But for those of you who want to achieve even higher levels of availability, let's push forward and turn to the next step. So we've solved a lot of the problem with the static IP addresses and snapshots, but the next thing we need to tackle is launching that Lightsail instance and creating it. So there's still some amount of time that it takes to actually spin up a new Lightsail instance with a snapshot, change that static IP address over. It's not a lot of time, but we want to continue reducing that. So instead of focusing though on speeding that creation up, we're going to solve the problem in a little different manner. And in this case, we're going to solve it through redundancy. And this is probably familiar ground for many of you. It turns out that the key to a lot of high availability often comes in the form of redundancy. And as is the case with sheep, maybe the more you have, the less likely you are to notice if one goes missing. So you can add more and more and more, and finally get to the point where if that one stray sheep goes missing, you might not necessarily notice it. And in this case, if I have X number of WordPress instances up and running and serving traffic for my customers, if one of them fails at any point in time, the impact that single failure can be minimized by adding more instances. But it's not like cloning sheep. We not very often can we simply clone WordPress instances or WordPress servers and achieve higher availability, except in sort of a derivative case where you have a fully static WordPress site that doesn't change. And in that case, maybe you should be using something else. But to see why this fails, and again, this is probably a review for many of you who are WordPress experts, but I want to take a quick high-level view of WordPress internals. And again, as you can see here, this is a very high level view. So if when I break WordPress down, I kind of look at it from this perspective. There's the web server, it might be running Apache or Nginx. There's the application, the WordPress itself and any modifications you might make to it in PHP. And there's the database, and then there's the file system. So I kind of break it up into those four major components. Obviously, there's more nuance here, but for the purpose of this talk, I've added sort of a horizontal line here to indicate sort of separation of parts of a system that change infrequently, like the web server and the WordPress itself, and where things change frequently, like where the data is stored, the database and the file system. So when we think about it, the database stores a big chunk of the data that WordPress needs. For example, user account information and blog posts. But the file system stores another portion of that data. For example, when you upload new content or new images to your WordPress server, those images ultimately will get stored on the file system. And in the case with like themes or plugins, you'll see both the database and the file system being used to store that information. So the database might hold information about plugins and what theme is currently active, but the file system actually stores the code for those themes and plugin. So when I mentioned you can't simply duplicate a WordPress instance and achieve high availability. Let's take a look and just follow a typical interaction just to overemphasize this. Suppose you have a single WordPress instance and someone publishes a blog post to that instance. So they publish the blog post and they upload the instance. That information is stored in the database on the left, and the image for that blog post, or images might be stored in the file system on the right-hand side. So later on, when someone wants to read that blog post, they go to that same site and they follow a similar path. So far, so good. So what happens if you actually add another WordPress instance to the mix? Well, at first it might seem to work. You might have a load balancer in place. Maybe there's some instance affinity associated with that. And by that, I mean, when someone navigates to your site, the load balancer might try to route those requests to the same WordPress instance based on that user's IP address or some other information. So there may be some session affinity in place. But then what happens if instance A in this case is busy and the load balancer routes users to instance B? Well, that blog post that was uploaded doesn't exist there, because each WordPress instance, in our case, a Lightsail instance that we launch, is configured to use its own local database and local file system. So you probably get what I'm getting at here. This, achieving high availability in this case isn't simply a high availability problem, but rather a shared resource problem. So we have to solve it before we can achieve higher availability later on in our system. And so, as I inferred, the solution to this problem is really the use of shared resources like databases and file systems. And we want to have something like this where all of our WordPress instances are sharing those same resources. And many of you have probably already done this before. You've launched your own database, you've established a shared file system. So let's go back to our WordPress internals chart, or mine, and talk about how we can do that on Lightsail. So first, let's start by moving the database outside or off of the Lightsail instance itself. And again, many of you have probably done this before, where you have another server that's running a database so that all of your WordPress instances can use that. So we can share this database across multiple instances, and then we configure each instance to use that external database. And as I mentioned, we can easily do that on Lightsail through the use of Lightsail Databases. So Lightsail Databases are fully managed databases that you can launch, in this case, MySQL or Postgres, that are already highly available, such that you can point instances, your WordPress instances, to these and already have the level of high availability that you're looking for. They handle automatic failover. So in the case of an HA Lightsail database, there's a primary instance and a secondary instance. All of your traffic is targeted at the primary instance. If there's ever a failover or ever a failure, Lightsail manages that failover for you. So if there's a failure of the primary, traffic will be redirected to the secondary, and it will take over the role as the primary, and then a new secondary will be brought up in its place. The other nice thing about Lightsail managed databases are automated backups. So similar to snapshots that I mentioned with Lightsail instances, you can get automated backups of your Lightsail databases that include a 7-day, 5-minute point-in-time recovery. So you could restore your database to any 5-minute increment over the last 7 days. So what does that mean for us in terms of high availability? Well, let's go back to our scorecard. And as I mentioned, in terms of HA, it really doesn't reduce the overall RTO of our system. So if our system fails, if one of our Lightsail instances fails, for example, we still have to bring that new Lightsail instance up and then switch the static IP address. But what this does help us improve is our RPO. And as I mentioned previously, our RPO was 24 hours based on the snapshots that we were doing of an individual Lightsail instance that had the database on it. So we know we can always go back 24 hours, and you might be able to reduce that through the use of third-party plugins. But now, in the case of using a Lightsail database, what this really does is it reduces our RPO down to potentially 5 minutes. So we could recover our system in 5-minute increments. Now, it does introduce some complications because now we have to synchronize recovery of the database with the file system, which we'll get to next. But in theory, you can significantly reduce your RPO through the use of a highly available Lightsail database. So now that we've solved that database problem or the database availability issue, let's look at the file system next. So what we really want to do is move the file system, like the database, off the Lightsail instance itself. And so to do this, I'm going to further partition the file system into parts that are updated sort of infrequently, like maybe themes or plugins, and parts that are updated frequently. So maybe contents and uploads if you have an active site and lots of contributions to it. So this allows us to deal specifically with the use case I was talking about before, where someone is uploading, multiple people are uploading and updating a WordPress site using multiple Lightsail instances behind a load balancer. There are, I'll mention this a little bit later on, but this means that we have to deal with, updating other parts of the system, like, WordPress updates or themes or plugins a little bit differently, and it gets a little bit more involved. But and I'll mention that later on. But to solve this particular use case, that of sharing content across multiple instances, we can use it's really a two-part solution, and that is the use of Amazon S3, which some of you may be familiar with. It's our Amazon's or AWS's cloud object storage, fully managed, highly available, a highly durable object storage. So instead of storing that content like images or videos or other user-provided content locally on a local file system, we actually store it in S3. Now, this requires the use of a plugin. So you could use a third-party plugin like W3 Total Cache or Offload Media Lite. Many of you may be familiar with W3 Total Cache. It's a much more comprehensive plugin. It does much more than just dealing with uploaded media, whereas Offload Media Lite is very specific to that use case. So it really just handles that media. In this particular use case, what these plugins do is they when a user uploads an image, a video, or document, or other media through the WordPress media uploader, they automatically upload those to Amazon S3, to a bucket in Amazon S3, and store them there. And then they replace the URL to each of those media files with its respective S3 URL. You could also use it with updated to use Amazon CloudFront or other CDNs too. And you can also do this with image thumbnails. So this solves that particular problem of accessing shared media from separate WordPress instances. So if we go back to our WordPress internals page, we've moved the database off of the file system, and now we have a system that looks more like this, the one we were looking at before. The only thing we haven't talked about yet, though, is we've moved the database off of the instance. We've moved the frequently changing files on the file system off of the instance. We've effectively made this instance fairly stateless. But the thing that we haven't talked about yet is that load balancer that's in the middle of this screen. And I'll talk about that next. As you might guess, I'm going to suggest that you can solve that particular part of this puzzle with a Lightsail load balancer. And Lightsail load balancers are fully managed load balancers that allow you to very easily attach and detach instances. So say, for example, you wanted your site to run on 2 instances instead of 1. So in case one of them failed, you always had, the other one was always up and running, and you could handle traffic on that one. You could do that very easily with a Lightsail load balancer. So you attach and detach easily. The Lightsail load balancers run automated health checks against Lightsail instances, in this case WordPress. If it detects, or if one of those instances is unresponsive, it will automatically remove it from rotation and not send traffic to it, but continue to run those health checks. And then when it does recover, then we'll start routing traffic to it. Load balancers also allow for a much more scalable system. You can very easily add many more instances behind a load balancer. Say, for example, you had a particular event that was going to happen where you expected a high level of traffic on your WordPress instance. You could add several different instances of WordPress behind that load balancer ahead of the event. And then once the event was over, you could remove those instances when they were no longer needed. Again, these instances, you're only charged for these instances when you're actually using them. So you can scale up and down very easily doing this. So with the addition of the load balancer, now we can start to see what a complete, highly available solution looks like on Amazon Lightsail. So really, to review, we added a static IP address and a snapshot and Lightsail Snapshots. We got a lot of mileage out of those. Then we added an HA Lightsail database, which greatly improved our RPO. And then when we use that in concert with Amazon S3 and a plugin to take care of shared resources, and then add a Lightsail load balancer, we can really start to see the impact on RTO, where once we defined our RTO in terms of minutes, now we could potentially get it down 2 seconds. It could be, if you have multiple Lightsail instances running WordPress up and running, and one of those fails, then there's really no impact to your end user. So we've achieved a pretty high level of availability just using some very simple techniques on Amazon Lightsail. So let me review what we've gone through up to this point. We started out with a really bare bones Lightsail instance running WordPress. Some of the features and best practices that we use, we added a Lightsail static IP address, which significantly reduced our RTO. It solved the problem with DNS propagation if IP addresses on the instance ever changed. Then we added Lightsail Snapshots. Lightsail Snapshots further reduced the RTO by allowing us to essentially reconstitute a Lightsail instance very easily based on a snapshot. That also that also defined our RPO, or our recovery point objective. At worst case, if there was a catastrophic system failure of our single instance, we would only lose up to 24 hours worth of data. Then we added a Lightsail database, which didn't directly add or reduce our RTO, but affected our RPO. And then we added Amazon S3 in concert with a third-party plugin to use or to effectively build out a shared file system using cloud storage for that. And then finally, we added a Lightsail load balancer to help us add multiple instances behind or multiple WordPress instances to handle traffic. So these, the 5 topics that I covered tonight here, I spoke about them specifically in the case of WordPress and even more specifically on Lightsail. But these concepts apply across multiple different types of LAMP stacks running on AWS and running on AWS, or running on Lightsail, I should say. And even further, these concepts around static IP addresses and snapshots and shared databases and file systems, they apply regardless of the provider that you're using to run your WordPress. So you can take those and apply them wherever you're running. But as I mentioned during this discussion, there are other topics that, if you want to get even higher levels of high availability, then you might try other things. I briefly mentioned Lightsail CDN, which is powered by Amazon CloudFront, a content delivery network. You can add that in front of your Lightsail instance. I didn't mention the use of elastic file system. In the case of a shared file system, I mentioned using S3 and a plugin. You could also actually implement a shared file system using Amazon Elastic File System. That's worth a talk in and of itself. The third bullet item here, instance administration. I briefly mentioned that I sort of hand waved over, well, what happens if you update WordPress or you add a new theme or you change themes or you add a new theme or add a new plugin? How do you deal with that? So there's again another talk around just administering that, because you have to then go create a new image effectively of these instances and then share it across all of your Lightsail instances that are running. But it's easy enough to do. I also think that right-sizing instances is interesting in and of itself. So if you're building a highly available WordPress site, and you're going from one single instance to two instances to make it more highly available, does that mean that each of those two instances only need half the capacity of the original instance? Does that buy you the level of high availability that you need? Or what are other methods for determining how to right size those instances to better match your particular demand and capacity needs? And then finally, you may find out that through all of this, you need to graduate to EC2. So how can you take your WordPress instance, whether highly available or not, that's running on Lightsail, and move it lock, stock, and barrel over to EC2? So a lot of other things to talk about here. I've briefly covered just taking a single Lightsail instance and making it highly available on Lightsail, but many more topics to cover. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to field any of those now.
Awesome. Thank you. That was really thorough. Anybody have any questions? Any questions for Jerry? Seriously, that was really interesting. Just also the overview of of how AWS can work with. I'm guessing it's can work with any website, not just WordPress. So it was pretty interesting.
It's interesting. I come from an architecture background, and so this, we see a lot of WordPress users on Lightsail, and as they grow, they naturally progress to wanting to be more highly available, having more capacity, and then a logical extension from that is just moving over to AWS proper. But that brings with it some challenges of its own.
Got it. And deploying like a medium-sized instance or whatever, I guess it's just as easy. It's as simple as clicking a button you mentioned.
Absolutely. When you launch an instance, you choose the capacity that you want, whether that's you need a half a gig of RAM or 2 gigs of RAM and 2 virtual CPUs. You simply pick it and then click a button and you launch it. And if WordPress is the blueprint that you've chosen, it literally in just seconds or minutes, you can log into the admin site and start configuring your WordPress site and running it.
Nice. We got a couple of questions here. Jack's asking, he just wants to be clear on how AWS works with paying when using, like when you stop an instance and it's just sitting idle. Are we paying for that?
No, you're only paying for it when you're using it. And this is similar to other AWS services like EC2 instances, for example. As long as that instance is not running, then you're not paying for it. So think of it as if you're familiar with VMs and virtual machines, at that point, it's not actually using any resources other than potentially storage for that VM and that snapshot. So once you stop that instance, you're no longer being charged for running that instance. So which makes the scalability option really nice, because if you have a huge spike in demand that you've got your own Black Friday coming up, you can spin up, attach a bunch of those instances behind a load balancer, let them handle all of that increased traffic. And then when that day is over, that event is over, you can stop those instances, remove them from the load balancer, and then you're no longer paying for them.
Nice. You mentioned setting up a new WordPress site. Larry's asking about bringing an existing WordPress site over to AWS. I have some ideas using just a standard migration plugin, right? But what other updates, what changes will we need to make once that migration plugin is complete?
So you're absolutely right. You use the same techniques. If you have migration plugins that you're using or some other manual process that you're using, you can use that same technique. And actually, that's what I would recommend: is you just do things normally. It just happens to be running on Lightsail. So you'll have to configure the database, or if you have to configure host parameters or ports or database credentials, those sorts of things. You have to do all of that on Lightsail as well. So it really is literally just a WordPress instance, or WordPress running on a Linux instance, for example. So you'd use some of the same techniques there. Yeah. So if you have I can't think of a more complex solution that would require a more complex answer to that, but I think in the vast majority of cases, you're just going to be using those same techniques. It doesn't differ at all.
Got it. Larry was again, where I guess these some people are a little bit new to AWS and some ideas. This is a great talk to have. We never really dove into this at the meetup, but maybe some trade-offs between running your own, essentially your own instance, your own website on AWS versus the total extreme, which is a managed host, right? Like a WP engine. What are those trade-offs? Is there any support? Like how does this work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The trade-off is really how much of that. So when I'm talking about Lightsail, you're then taking over responsibility for managing the underlying infrastructure. I mean, AWS is going to manage the Lightsail instance for you, but you're responsible for whether you need to use a load balancer, or you need to use a shared database, or you're going to have some sort of scaling policies in place, what shared file system, and exactly the things that I spoke about tonight. Those are the things that you would have to take ownership for, where on a fully managed solution, that's taken care of for you. Now, the upside to managing it yourself is typically that comes at a reduced cost. So you're taking over some of that responsibility. Now, you can extend that even further from Lightsail to AWS itself, and using, instead of using Lightsail, you use EC2 instances and RDS databases and application load balancers. It's the same thing. If you move from Lightsail to AWS, you're taking over more responsibility for that underlying infrastructure in terms of just managing it and administering it. And so it does take more effort, I think, for those developers who have that sort of experience and are looking to manage the infrastructure themselves and to save potentially on managing it themselves. It's a good option.
Nice. Any other questions? So yeah, maybe there's a couple of levels of working with WordPress, and I how much do you want to be involved? Do you want to manage WordPress itself? Do you want to manage and update the themes or write a plugin, or do you want to manage everything from top to bottom, including the instance, right? So
yeah, that's really key is when you start moving in that direction, whether you're moving from a managed provider to Lightsail, which is a VPS that already potentially has WordPress on it and running, or do you want to move to AWS proper? All of those, you have to think about what responsibilities are you taking on by doing that were previously handled by that managed service provider.
Can you talk about expanding on this? And I'll let you mention it. Talk about like upgrading. A new version of PHP comes out. How do we handle that, right? With if you're managing your own site at Lightsail.
So you have complete access to these instances. You can, for example, SSH into one of these instances and upgrade any of the software that's on it, whether that be WordPress itself, whether that be PHP or some underlying libraries. Once you've launched that instance, you have complete ownership of it, and you can make whatever changes you want to it. As I mentioned during my talk, if you're building out a highly available system, though, that there's another level of administration that you have to take care of, and that is how do you roll that change out to multiple instances that are running versus just updating a single one. But it's pretty straightforward to do that. But I mean, the bottom line, the answer is you can make those changes just like you would anywhere else. If you have to update PHP, for example, SSH into the instance, make whatever changes you have, test it, and then roll that out to the other instances that are running.
Nice. And also, the costs you mentioned are so low. So if you want to just play around with the WordPress site on AWS, right before you go live or production, I mean, you really could just play around and get your feet wet.
You can Lightsail has a free tier, so you can go in and you can launch. You saw on the far left of that one slide, it was $3.50 a month to run this Lightsail instance running WordPress or what have you. And we also have a free tier, so that means you can actually run it for free for a period of time and test drive it and see what you think about it very easily.
Great. Any other questions for Jerry? Anything? Anyone? Going once, going twice. Jerry, this was great. Again, this is going to be on YouTube, hopefully within a couple of days if I get around to editing it. There's a lot of stuff here. Actually, I took a bunch of screenshots. There's a lot of good information here. So, feel free to review it and please share it. So, Jerry, thank you again for coming here today.